welcome back to another episode of our podcast, Nothing in My Brain. I'm Olivia.
I'm Joey. And in this episode, we are honored to welcome Sadie Sutton, host of the podcast She Persisted and an advocate for teen mental health.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be on our podcast today. We're really excited to have you here.
Appreciate it.
Of course. I'm so excited to be here and thank you for having me.
Okay, great. So just starting off to give our listeners some context, could you briefly introduce your journey with mental health?
Yes, for sure. Let me just make sure. Okay, that input is correct. Yes, so I struggled a lot with my mental health in middle school. And the beginning of high school, I struggled a lot with depression and anxiety. And when I first started experiencing those, I didn't really understand what was happening. It's kind of adjusted and crept up on me so slowly. And I really didn't understand what I was experiencing. It got to the point where all I could remember was being overwhelmed and stressed and not really enjoying things and not feeling a lot of joy, not feeling understood, not having that sense of belonging. And so for me, it really felt like, well, that was just how my brain worked. I didn't have these super clear memories or a point that I could compare my mental health to where I was like, oh, I felt great about my mental health. I felt supported. I felt like I had coping skills. And so I got to this headspace where it was like all I've ever known is feeling depressed and anxious. And so that showed up for me in a lot of different ways. I struggled a lot with a lot of conflict with my parents. I was really irritable. My sleep was a complete disaster, a lot of avoidance of sleep or trying to work on schoolwork over the night to avoid what I was experiencing. I was isolating from my friends a lot. I spent all my time in my room. I was in unhealthy relationships, a lot of anxiety about things that didn't used to bring me distress, a lot of panic attacks. And as I became more and more enmeshed in these experiences, I started to cope with them in more ineffective ways and use coping skills that weren't necessarily healthy or making things better. And so my parents were really aware that things weren't going as they should and that I was struggling in a big way with my mental health. And so I was really lucky in that they got me support that I needed, and that started at the pediatrician and going in for that standard screening. And from there, I ended up using a whole host of mental health resources in our immediate area. I was hospitalized 4 times for depression and suicidal ideation. I tried everything you can imagine on an outpatient basis, whether it was intensive outpatient, partial hospitalizations, outpatient DBT, individual therapy, family therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, group therapy, occupational therapy, you name it, we tried it. A number of different medication management providers. And I really wasn't seeing a difference in the anxiety, the depression, or these maladaptive coping mechanisms. And so I got to the point halfway through my freshman year of high school where we'd really exhausted our options, and I was struggling to show up regularly to school. My attendance was suffering. My relationships were really unhealthy. I still had these extreme irregularities with my sleep schedule and diet, and still conflict with my parents and effective ways of coping with things like self-harm and suicidal ideation. And so I ended up getting a year and a half of intensive treatment. I went to the East Coast to an intensive DBT program called 3 East at McLean Hospital. And those 14 weeks were really pivotal. They really changed my life. They saved my life. I was really backed into a corner when it came to my mental health. I didn't have a lot of options because a lot of these things as an adolescent that allow us to have a sense of autonomy and choice are dependent on these basic things. Are you going to school? Sometimes it's, are you getting passing grades? Are you engaging in your relationships? And I wasn't doing any of those things. And so the options were engage in this resource, get support, you're in treatment, or you have even less autonomy and you're not going to have a choice when it comes to what program you're at or who you're working with, because I really wasn't engaging in that capacity. And so I ended up doing 14 weeks of DBT, or Dialectical Behavioral Therapy, which is an evidence-based treatment for depression and anxiety, especially for adolescents. It works really well for emotion dysregulation, being ineffective in relationships, self-harm, suicidal ideation, and we can dive into DBT as well. But that was really a very effective 14 weeks for me. It allowed me to create a foundation for my mental health, beginning stages of big recovery from depression, learn the skills that would allow me to thrive and practice implementing them in a new environment, because it can be really hard to do the work in the same environment because you're there's all these habits and routines you've created, it's really easy to slip back into those unhealthy relationships or maladaptive coping mechanisms because you're experiencing the same sugars in the same day to day. Those changes are really hard to make when the environment isn't shifted either. I was able to build kind of like a foundation of a relationship with my parents. We learned about validation and vulnerability, and I started asking for help, which was something that I hadn't been doing up until that point. And so it was really a game changer when it came to understanding what I needed to do to not be depressed on a day-to-day basis, what was important when it came to having a healthy relationship with my parents, because that is another thing that's really key when you're still in high school. And then as well, understanding why I was getting anxious and how I could navigate that anxiety. And then after that, I did 14 months at a therapeutic boarding school with the goal of kind of maintaining that progress. And then I went home. So my sophomore year was at the therapeutic boarding school. My junior year of high school was back normal local public school, and I started the podcast with the goal of sharing what I learned in mental health treatment and helping others that needed support with their mental health but maybe didn't require intensive treatment, trying to prevent others from experiencing what I had gone through because so much of it was preventable. And I also was really aware that there weren't a lot of teens talking about mental health recovery. If you were doing well with your mental health as a teen, you're probably not articulating what it is that you're doing that's allowing you to thrive. And if you're struggling and you're getting treatment or professional support, you're kind of in a vacuum chamber of other teens who are also struggling. So there's not this perspective of, I've been in this exact context, and here's how I was able to get into recovery. Here's what I wish I knew. I promise this works. And of course, I heard from so many adults in my community that recovery is possible and treatment will be helpful and therapy is an important resource. But it was really hard to believe them because I was like, you have so much autonomy over your life. Like, it's just not the same. You don't get it. This is all I've ever felt. And so I felt that that perspective was lacking. And so I started the podcast like 5 years ago now, and I am now 200 episodes in and continuing to try and create the resource that I wish I had when I was struggling with my mental health, and have those conversations for Gen Z and make these resources more accessible, more understandable, and kind of bring what I've learned now from the more academic side as a psychology major at Penn and hoping to get my PhD in clinical psych to this audience and make these insights accessible.
Yeah, that was really well said, and I think you like your story, like you being vulnerable and stuff, is just really inspiring. Especially, I love how you said that like your podcast is like from a teenage perspective, so it just allows teens to feel heard rather than like from an adult perspective, which is different because it's kind of hard to feel validated when you're a teen going through these struggles. So, could you maybe talk more about what the treatment program was like?
Yeah, so I'll give you the residential program initial kind of perspective, and then we can talk about the boarding school as well, which was kind of a unique experience. So what's really great about a residential is that you are able to get wraparound support. Like, you're getting 24-hour care. And so for someone who's struggling with safety, for someone who's struggling with a regular sleep schedule, for someone who has had access to these skills and therapeutic supports and hasn't been able to implement them on their own, it can be a really important level of care. And it's definitely not a first option. Like, we exhausted every single resource, and every single clinician I had worked with was like, we can't offer support at this outpatient level anymore. It's not working, and she needs more support. And so that's kind of why we went to the intensive residential program. So if you're listening and you're like, I'm struggling with my mental health, that's not going to be the first option you're presented with. But if you've tried a number of resources and you've had access to the skills and access to the therapist, and things really aren't changing, and there are those levels of concern, whether for some people it's maybe related to eating behaviors, there's a safety concern there. For some people it's more self-harm, suicidal ideation, there's a safety concern there. That 24-hour wraparound support can be necessary and really effective. And what I found was that I had access to the skills, I had access to the therapist, I had access to these, like, they're all the resources that I would have needed. But I really struggled to implement them in my home environment because over years I had created these ways of thinking. I had really like discouraged being vulnerable to my parents and asking for help. I was kind of like living in a world where I had like created all these habits and ways of thinking that were really maladaptive. So like I'm feeling stressed, I'm going to shut down and go to my room. I'm feeling like no one is understanding what I'm going through, I'm going to engage in this maladaptive coping mechanism. I'm feeling anxious and depressed, I'm not going to school. And so I had just reinforced these ways of coping within my daily triggers, within my daily relationships, within my daily schedule over years at that point. And so it was really hard to make changes that were leading to meaningful outcomes. And so for me, being in that entirely new environment and getting to like practice these skills and practice being vulnerable and practice asking for help and practice a regular sleep schedule was a game changer. And getting 14 weeks under your belt of like, here's how I have better sleep habits. Here's how I be vulnerable and ask for help. Here's how I use skills so that I'm not depressed. Here's how I navigate a panic attack. That was really a game changer to know, like, okay, if I do these things, I won't feel depressed. I won't feel anxious. I will feel supported. And so then when I maybe visiting family or visiting home, or then in the new environment at the therapeutic boarding school, I built that level of trust with myself of like, I know what to do. And if I do it, I'll feel better. And having that sense of like mastery and trust and confidence, which when you're struggling with your mental health for the first time, not knowing any way to alleviate the distress is so incredibly disempowering. Like you try things, you don't really know if it'll work. You don't have the trust in yourself that you can navigate the situation. And so being able to establish that in a residential setting was really a game changer for me. Um, and obviously, again, it's not a first line option. It's not the first resource you're presented with, but for some people, it can be really helpful. And that's one way that it was helpful for me. And it also was like, I was able to do so much work. Like I was doing therapy 5 days a week, and I was doing group therapy twice a day, every day. And I was sitting down in classes learning about the coping skills for 4 hours every day. So, like, the level of support and work I was able to do during like a shortened period of time is so different from what you're able to do at home when you're seeing a therapist once a week. And then from there was kind of the option and the question of like, what do I do next? And I had had this track record of like 2 or 3 years of being depressed at home, not a lot of luck with outpatient options or resources. And so there was this concern of like, if she goes home back into this environment where she had created all these habits and routines and pathways that were really ineffective, will she relapse? Will she go back to feeling depressed and anxious and isolating? And so my treatment team and family decided was the best option was to do a therapeutic boarding school. And in theory, sounds like a great option. In practice, not supported by research. And it actually ended up being part of the troubled teen industry, which if you've heard of Paris Hilton, the Catch Me Outside girl, she went to one of those programs. Dr. Phil has sent people to them. It's this collection of programs in the United States that aren't backed by evidence. They're not properly regulated, and they lead to a lot of harm, whether it's physical harm for kids that are in wilderness programs and are dehydrated and malnourished or get injured, or psychological harm. And so for me, that meant for those 14 months, I had really limited contact with family. I was in the middle of nowhere, Montana. I wasn't receiving a standard of evidence-based care. 51% of my custody was signed over to this program. There was a lot of elements that made it not as great of an experience compared to the residential I went to. And so after the fact, transitioning home, I was lucky in that I was able to pull from that foundation I created at residential. And like I had the skills, I had the relationship with my parents. We leaned really heavily on that work we'd done on McLean, continued to like maintain that progress throughout the time at the therapeutic boarding school. I was able to transition home, didn't relapse, continue to like maintain the progress that I'd made, but definitely in the years after that, being like, wow, that was like not really what I thought it was. There's a lot of parts of that experience that was traumatic or shouldn't have gone as it did. And so that's been definitely another angle to my mental health experience in the podcast, which is that we have so many evidence-based resources when it comes to mental health. And the fact that families and teens are presented with harmful solutions is just so heartbreaking. And so being really clear about like, here's what the evidence supports, here are the options that actually work, and here are the ones that unfortunately aren't evidence-backed, and in a lot of cases cause harm when you're just looking for support for your teen.
Yeah, I love how you brought up like the trouble teen. That was really interesting, especially because I haven't heard much about it and like I didn't know it was not backed by evidence.
Yeah, so for our next question, you mentioned like DBT and various other forms of therapy helping you. So could you please elaborate on maybe like what skills or techniques you've learned that sort of helped you over the years?
Yeah, there seriously are so many. So I'll give you like a couple, and if there's any that you're like, that's super interesting, we can dive in more. But I think what most people who have done a lot of therapy work will find is that picking and choosing from different methodologies and keeping what works for you and leaving what doesn't tends to be like the best way to set yourself up for success. And so for me, DBT was super helpful. DBT stands for Dialectical Behavioral Therapy. It was developed by Marsha Linehan at the University of Washington for adults with borderline personality disorder. So, borderline personality disorder is really kind of, if you think about it as like, what does that mean? What does that look like? A lot of emotional dysregulation, a lot of instability in relationships. A lot of these patients were really, really suicidal. They didn't really want to do the work, they were really hopeless. Just a lot of distress and difficulty tolerating that distress, lots of crises. And so she wanted to develop a treatment for this group of people that most therapists didn't want to work with because they were a liability, they weren't getting better, there was no treatment that existed that was evidence-based for borderline personality disorder. So she set out to create this treatment that would help people who were extremely depressed, extremely ineffective in relationships, really dysregulated emotionally, and really suicidal. And so she started to develop DBT, and the kind of dialectic that it balances on is acceptance and change. So we have to accept our circumstances and work to change them. And she found this dialectic by going to patients and saying, you just have to accept the cards you've been dealt. Like, this sucks. This is horrible. You just gotta, like, we have to accept that this is the situation you're in. And her patients got mad. They were like, what do you mean? Like, I created this problem for myself. Like, you're saying this is my fault. I didn't do this. This is not my fault that my life is so miserable. They hated her. And then when they were like, you just have to change the situation. Like, you just have to shift the outcome, just do the work. They were like, so I didn't create these problems for myself. Like, what do you mean I have to change them? Like, they were really frustrated as well. And so instead, what she did is she led with acceptance and said, this is a really horrible situation to be in. You are in so much pain, and no one should have to navigate this. And what can we do to make your life worth living? What can we do to make this more tolerable and improve your lived experience? And that's when patients responded well to her and started to get better. And so DBT is like a very set protocol that therapists do. And there's that acceptance change piece, which is really relevant in the therapeutic relationship. And then there's also a bunch of skills that you learn. And so you go to like a class, basically, like a group, and you learn these skills. And they target tolerating distress, being effective in your interpersonal relationships, regulating your emotions, and being more mindful. And so to give you like one example of a DBT skill, we have this thing called TIP, and it's an acronym that stands for temperature, intense exercise, paced breathing, and paired muscle relaxation. And TIP is a skill in the distress tolerance module. So if you're having a panic attack, if you just had a really intense argument with your parents, if you're in a crisis, like 8 or a 9 out of 10 as far as your emotions, that's when we use distress tolerance skills. And so for TIP, we have 4 ways that we can reduce the physiological stress. And that would be like, your mind is racing, your heart rate is going so quickly, you can't catch your breath, your muscles are tense, you like feel like your emotions are all running around within you. It's really overwhelming. You can't even focus on trying to talk yourself off this ledge of distress because like the physical is so overwhelming. And so with TIP, we have this first part, which is temperature, which you take a bowl of ice water and you submerge your face in that ice water for as long as you can. Take a breath, put your face back in, and 100% of the time, that will lower your heart rate and your breathing rate. It uses your mammalian diving reflex. And so what that does is it slows down our heart rate and our breathing rate. So when we come in contact with cold water, our body's like, okay, we're going swimming. If we don't lower our heart rate, we will produce too much carbon dioxide and drown. So 100% of the time when you put your face in a bowl of ice water, your heart rate and your breathing rate slows down. Which for people having a panic attack or who just are super angry and had a really intense argument, being able to get like the heart rate and the breathing rate to slow down so you can focus on the mental instead of the physical is a game changer. Intense exercise does a similar thing, where our body has this natural way of lowering our heart rate after we exercise. It can't maintain that level of output for a long period of time. So after we do sprints, your body works really hard to really quickly lower your heart rate. So if you are having a panic attack and your heart rate is going really quickly, if you do some sprints, if you do some burpees, if you do a really intense exercise like that, your body will lower your heart rate past where it was from that panic attack. So again, alleviating the physical so you can focus on the mental. And then pace breathing, lowering your breathing rate by breathing more slowly, paired muscle relaxation with the breathing. When you inhale, you clench your muscles. When you exhale, you release them and you let go of that tension that's accumulated from that intense emotion. These skills are things that can be implemented by anyone. You don't have to be an adult borderline personality patient. You can be navigating a anxiety about a test coming up. You could be preparing to have a more effective conversation with your parents about your plans for spring break. Like we can use these skills in any context to be more effective. And so that's DBT, which was really helpful for me. I'm also a big fan of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is working on the thoughts to impact your behaviors and your emotions. And so CBT has this framework that I find really effective, which is like a triangle. So our thoughts impact our emotions, which impact our behaviors. And we can kind of come at any of those perspectives and see an outcome. So we talked about the behavior, which is, for example, tip, that then in part impacts the emotions and the thought spiral that's happening. Similarly, with CBT, there's a lot that's done to label and improve ineffective ways of thinking. So like black or white thinking or overgeneralizing. And by adjusting that thought process, having it be more effective, we then are able to impact the emotion and the actions that we take as a result. I'm also a big fan of CBTI, which is really great for sleep hygiene and lots of ways of reframing how we think about sleep and increasing our behavioral effectiveness there. I also love positive psychology, which is research that has been done not on what's going on for these people that are really struggling with their mental health, but what are the people that are thriving doing? And it's the framework that they give is PERMA, so positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. And having those areas be in check help us build this life worth living. So I think like both sides of the equation here of like addressing the distress and being able to work through that, but then building this life that we really enjoy and love and look forward to. And so pulling from these different frameworks can be really helpful and effective when it comes to mental health.
Yeah, that was really well said and very detailed. And I love how you like mentioned all like the different types of perspectives and how, they can be like universal. They don't just have to be for like this certain disorder or something. So, yeah, kind of related. What do you think are like the biggest mental health challenges that teens face today?
Yeah, and I would love to get your guys' thoughts on this after because unfortunately I'm becoming old. I'm now 22, and so I'm not as like tapped into the day to day. I obviously can speak so much to my lived experience and what it was like struggling as a teen, but things change and evolve, and so I'd love your guys' thoughts as well after this. There's a lot of different thoughts going around, right? I'm sure you guys are constantly hearing about phones are the problem, phones are why you're depressed and anxious, phones are why people aren't doing the things that they used to. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I don't think that phones help, but I think it's like a band-aid to solution to a larger problem. My theory on why teens struggle so much with mental health is this thing called agency. So, agency is the belief that our actions will have a meaningful impact on our lives. So, like if I'm having a panic attack, if does the coping skill I try, will that make me feel better? If I study for a test, will I do well on that test? If I join extracurriculars and try my best in high school, will I get into a college I want to go to? If I show up at school and try to talk to new people, will I make meaningful friends in my life? And I feel like at an individual level, like those actions we take on a day-to-day basis to build lives we love, I feel like we have less trust that our actions are going to have meaningful outcomes. Whether it's our relationships, our performance in school, our emotional experiences, our mental health, and then also on a larger scale, which is that I think as Gen Z, we have so much hope for the future, and we also feel so responsible for all these things that are happening, like the mental health crisis, the political landscape, the environment, like all of these things we want to solve, we want to improve, and that's also like a lot of responsibility. And I think the addition of social media, the awareness that we're responsible to make these really intense global changes, as a result means that we feel less agency. We are feeling less like the actions we take will have a meaningful outcome on those large scale issues. And so agency, we know from like a psychological construct, when we don't have that, a lot of things break down. And I think that sense of agency in Gen Z has been really disrupted with the expectations we set and the emotional challenges we're experiencing, and also the resources we're given to navigate those challenges. I would love your guys' thoughts. What do you think are like the biggest things Gen Z is struggling with and why?
Yeah, I think that our school actually prioritizes like mental health a lot more. I think
Yeah, it's
because they do provide resources and like tutorials about like
yeah, they've definitely been
yeah
like giving lessons on mental health now.
yeah. I think that just like the worst thing that we face is just
But
like misconceptions. Do you think?
well, I think like I really like how you like brought up that we feel a lot of responsibility. I think most of it just comes from a lot of pressure, especially since we live in like the Bay Area where there's a lot
Yeah,
of, like pressure to succeed, and like we feel like we have so much like ambition in us that we feel like we have to achieve a lot. And so I think that's like a big issue, and also just like a lot of comparison with other people. I know you
yeah.
said like social media wasn't like really the problem, but it kind of does like accelerate that comparison a lot. So,
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to explain it. And I think that's something that gets lost with social media. I don't think that what's happening on social media is new. Like, we still compare ourselves to people in person. We still look for validation in person. We still look for ways that we can get better at the things that we're doing. How can we succeed in person? We're just exposed to that on such a larger scale on social media. And so when we don't have the skills to combat that, that's where we struggle. But also, I don't necessarily think that like no social media is the solution either, because we now live in a world where it's everywhere. And so we're not really equipping teens if we're saying just delete all the apps. But then when you go to college, here's this brand new stressor that's going to derail your life. And so I think what you guys are saying, these resources where we have more skills, we learn how to take care of our mental health, I think that's important.
yeah, that's definitely true.
Yeah. So like on this subject, I think that like on a personal level, like how do you think teens should be able to recognize like their own symptoms of anxiety, depression, or burnout?
Yeah, so I think this is something that, again, you guys mentioned that like there's a lot of misconceptions about Gen Z, and this is one of them, which is like we're over-diagnosing, we're over-labeling. And I think one of the important things to think about here when we think about labels, because as Gen Z, we love a label. We're podcasters, we're like we attach these things to ourselves. We feel the desire to label ourselves or attach ourselves to these groups to find a sense of belonging, to find a sense of connection. We're not doing it for no reason. We want to find people like us. We want to feel seen and heard and understand and understood. And so I think that's absolutely true for mental health. Like when we are being vulnerable about these things and attaching these labels to ourselves, I don't think it's best to come at this from like you're overgeneralizing and self-diagnosing and this is so bad, but more like if people are being really assertive about what they're struggling with, and if people are self-diagnosing or seeking support for that thing, what's that need that's not being met? Which probably is that they don't have the resources, they don't feel seen, and they don't feel understood. And so when it comes to understanding where you're at with your mental health, as a teen, I think being mindful of my experience and just trying to be like, how am I feeling wasn't really effective because, like I mentioned, it crept up on me. And really quickly, my mentality was like, this is all I've ever felt. This is all I'll ever feel. It's just not possible for me to feel happy. So I don't necessarily think comparing to yourself and like your own benchmark is always the most effective, especially if that's skewed. So I think some awareness of like what's normal for mental health, which is that you're able to go through your day-to-day life with stress is helpful, right? It allows us to meet deadlines and get things done and achieve our goals, but not a level of stress where it's debilitating and where it's impacting our sleep or our relationships or doing things we enjoy. I think as far as burnout for that perspective, I would say for depression, it's really important to be aware of how we're speaking to ourselves. Do we like, are we happy with ourselves? Do we have traits about ourselves that we enjoy? When we're navigating a situation, do we say, wow, like I tried my best there and maybe I could do better next time, but like I did what I could given the situation. Or are you like, I did horrible, I'm a bad person. How could anyone like me because I was just so horrible in that context? And then I think the behavioral markers are really important. Do you feel excited to get up in the morning? Are you sleeping a lot more or a lot less than you should be? Are you feeling a lot more anxiety and dread and ruminating on things in your life? Are you eating more or less than you normally do? Are you working out more or less than you normally do? Your relationships are a big one. Are you isolating from friends or are you like seeking out people in kind of an unhealthy way, like to talk about these challenges that are all consuming and get validation because you're not finding that in a healthy way? I would say school is another one where this shows up a lot. Is it like an uphill battle to complete assignments? And then I also would say that is it feeling scary and daunting to ask for help? Which I would say for most people, if it feels scary or daunting to ask for help, something's not right. Because if you're generally doing okay, asking for support or help or being like, hey, I'm stressed about this test, like, do you want to study together? That's normal. That's fine. Like, we don't feel much anxiety about that going to a friend or the teacher. But if you're like, I am so stressed that I'm not able to complete any assignment, or I'm so depressed that I'm not able to get out of bed on the weekends. Then we feel more nervous to ask for help because we kind of know that we're not where we should be and we haven't been able to fix it ourselves. But I will also say that asking for help is the hardest part. Like for the first time voicing like I'm not okay and this is bigger than me and I can't do this myself is so scary, but it's downhill from there because you have people in your corner. You have people looking out for you, people supporting you, other resources you can lean on. And as a teen, it's also really important to go to an adult, not your friends. We can go to our friends for like, oh my God, that test was horrible, or things are kind of weird in the friend group right now, like what's happening? But going to friends for mental health support is like one of the worst things you can do. So going to like a guidance counselor, a teacher, a coach, a parent, a family friend, that is a much better route to go to because we care about our friends too much to put them in that position.
Yeah, I think you brought up so many great points with that. And so, since I was kind of wondering how you said you have to go to like a guidance like person instead of like your friends, since I know we only have like a little bit of time left, I was wondering if you could maybe quickly talk about how to support like a friend who may be struggling with their mental health.
So I have a lot of thoughts on this because I was so ineffective as a teen when it came to supporting my friends' mental health. Like in the hospital at the same time as people, going to the guidance counselor, being like, this person needs help immediately, and no one's like disaster. And also, I found myself seeking out other people that were struggling with their mental health because they were the only ones that understood what I was going through and made me feel seen and heard. And this was hugely ineffective. So I totally want to give validation there that like this is hard and this is challenging. And you are not setting yourself up for success if you're going to your friends for mental health support or if you are allowing your friends to come to you as like their main mental health resource, especially as a teen, because you're just so not equipped. So here's what I'll say, which is that there are certain things that we absolutely go to our friends to. Like that class is so annoying. That teacher is so mean. I hated that like conversation I had with that person, or this breakup is so hard. Like those things totally within the realm of going to your friends. But when we're talking about like extreme distress or depression or anxiety or maladaptive coping mechanisms, those are things that should be talked about with a professional or at the very least an adult. And so when it comes to supporting a friend, the first time they get a free pass if they go to you and try and have this conversation, which is that you've never set a boundary with them that that's not okay. So they don't even know that they shouldn't be going to you for that. You support them through the situation, you offer validation. Validation doesn't mean you're condoning the behavior or saying that it's okay that they're doing that thing, but like it makes sense that given the situation you're feeling stressed. Like I see how much pain you're in. This is so hard. Like I'm so sorry you're navigating this. So offering them support, getting through that crisis moment. But anytime after that first crisis that you allow them to come to you in that moment, that's on you. So you have to have a conversation when things are normal, things aren't stressful, a normal day, and say, here's the thing. I care about you too much to be the person you're going to in times of need. because I'm not equipped to help you navigate this. And in fact, I'm doing you a disservice by trying to be your support system because I don't know if I'm going to cause more harm or if I'm saying the wrong thing or if I'm responding. I'm not a therapist, like I'm not trained. I could be doing more harm than good if you come to me in this crisis. And if they say, I can't talk to anyone, my parents don't get it, I'm not allowed to go to therapy, you're the only person I can talk to, you can say, here is crisis text line. Here are the phone numbers you can call. Here's our guidance counselor. I'm happy to go with you to talk to them for the first time. You can talk to your pediatrician. Here's the therapist that works at our school. You can direct them to those resources. You can remind them that even though it feels like you're the only person that they can go to, that's not actually the case. And so check the facts for yourself also that like what they're saying isn't true. There are other resources. And explain to them that again, I care about you too much to have this conversation with you because I don't want to do something wrong. And so then when they come to you with that thing at any point going forward, if you allow them to have that conversation, if you allow them to use you as support, that's on you, not on them, if that makes sense. And so I would kind of like, and if you're like, that's hard, that's a big boundary to set. I would again go back to like, you care about this person, you love this person, you want what's best for them. And them going to you isn't what's best for them. And in fact, it could cause more harm if they're going to you instead of a therapist or a counselor or a parent. And you can also offer to say, like, if you're scared to talk to your parents about this, if you're scared to ask for a therapist, like, I'm happy to sit with you. I'm happy to help think about how you can make that request. So you can help them get resources, but understanding that you being their resource is doing them a disservice. And then the other piece that I would say is really important when supporting a friend through mental health challenges is just being their friend, like being that person that they can go to for a laugh or to study together or just to spend time together or get a break from what they're experiencing. Like that's honestly the best thing that anyone who's struggling could ask for is a friend they can go to and know that they feel seen and supported and have those positive moments.
Yeah, what you said about the friend's role, like that's definitely really important.
Yeah. So like since like we're gonna wrap this up with like our last question, so is there anything that you hope your podcast is able to do, like in terms of impacting teenagers who are in your audience, you know?
Yeah, there's so many things. I think like the guiding light and the guiding principle for the podcast has been trying to be the perspective and be the resource that I wish I would have had. And so the skills that I wish I would have known, the conversations that I wish I could have listened in on, the therapeutic insights that I didn't have when I was struggling. I really hope that I can offer those to teens. I really hope that I can make all the crazy, complicated psychology research that's out there understandable and accessible to teens. Because if you're struggling with depression, you shouldn't be expected to read like a journal article about why this one way of thinking about something is going to make you feel better. Like that's ridiculous. And I think another piece that's really relevant is that and is from one of my favorite books called Lost Connections by Johann Hari. And he says that one of the most powerful things you can do for someone struggling and in pain is to give them a story about why they're suffering and offer explanations and reasons and a purpose and a sense of meaning behind that pain. And so, if I can help explain these things and explain that maybe you're struggling now, but it's not going to feel that way forever, or you're feeling lonely and struggling to show up in your relationships, that totally makes sense. And here's why, according to research. I really hope I can help provide that to people and help them craft their own story and better understand what they're going through because it is so isolating and overwhelming and just so hard to understand, especially as a young adult. And so that's really my hope with the podcast.
Yeah, that is definitely so inspiring because as teens, we're like finding our identity, we're going through so much. So just your
Yeah.
podcast being there, it's kind of like the light, you know?
I hope so. And again, I'm getting older. Hopefully people will still listen. But no, I really, really hope that it's a helpful resource and that people who are struggling or trying to support someone who's struggling can find solace and support by listening.
Yeah.